But there's a moment when a man realizes the worst thing that ever happened to him wasn't an accident, it was a decision. Someone sat in a boardroom in a pressed suit with a company credit card and a lawyer on speed dial, and they chose to destroy him, chose to take his name, his career, his daughter's future. And they did it so cleanly he spent years believing he deserved it. This is the story of Ethan Rourke, a mechanic, a father, and the only man who saw what a billion-dollar company couldn't or wouldn't. If you're new here, hit subscribe and follow this story to the end, because we drop new stories every week that you don't want to miss. Drop a like and tell me in the comments, what city or country are you watching from? I want to see how far this story travels. The storm came in fast off Lake Erie, the way Michigan storms always do. No warning, just a wall of gray pressing down on the highway until the sky and the road looked like the same piece of dirty concrete. Ethan Rourke was driving back from a parts run in his 2009 F-150, the kind of truck that had been repaired so many times it was more Ethan's work than Ford's at this point. The defroster was going, the radio was off. He had a habit of driving in silence. He almost missed her. The car was a dark navy Meridian S-Class, the kind of luxury sedan that cost more than most people's houses. And it was sitting half on the gravel shoulder with its hazards blinking. Ethan clocked it at 60 miles an hour, and his foot came off the gas before his brain caught up with why. He'd spent 15 years reading broken-down vehicles the way other people read faces. Something about the angle of that car wasn't right. He pulled over 300 feet past it, sat there a second with his hands on the wheel, then put the truck in reverse. The woman standing outside the car was in her mid-70s, maybe older. White hair pulled back, a good wool coat soaked dark at the shoulders. She was holding her phone up like an offering to whatever cell tower might be listening. Her heels had sunk into the wet gravel, and she hadn't moved them, which told Ethan she was the kind of woman who'd learned not to show discomfort in public. He got out. The rain hit him immediately. "You need help, ma'am?" She looked at him with the measured wariness that older women traveling alone had every right to feel towards strangers on dark highways. He was 6'1", hadn't shaved since Tuesday, and his jacket had somebody else's transmission fluid on the left sleeve. "My car simply stopped," she said. "I've been trying to reach my driver for 20 minutes. May I take a look at it?" Another pause. She was deciding something. Then she gestured at the hood with the hand holding the phone, which Ethan took as a yes. The hood release was in the usual place. He propped it up and reached into the cab of his truck for the flashlight he kept in the center console, the long yellow mag light that his daughter Lily had painted little stars on with nail polish 2 years ago. He didn't need more than 90 seconds. "Your battery reads fine," he said, mostly to himself. "Then why won't it start?" "Because it's not the battery." He moved the light slowly. "Can I ask, has the car been sitting somewhere public in the last few days? A parking garage, a hotel lot, somewhere like that?" The woman stepped closer to him, which surprised him. She looked down at the engine with genuine curiosity, not the helpless squinting most people did. "I had lunch at the Alderton Club on Wednesday. Valet parking. Why?" Ethan kept the light moving. He didn't answer right away because he wasn't sure he was seeing what he thought he was seeing. He tilted the mag light, shifted his angle, leaned in closer. "Someone's been in here," he said. "I beg your pardon?" He straightened up. The rain was running off the back of his neck. "This isn't a mechanical failure. There's been a manual intervention in your ignition relay circuit. It's subtle. You'd have to know exactly what you were looking for. But someone disconnected a secondary fuel authorization loop. Carl cranked, but it won't fire." He paused. "It's the kind of thing you do if you want a car to break down at a specific time. Not right away. Delayed." The woman stared at him. Then she looked at the engine, then back at him. "Who are you?" "Ethan Rourke. I run a shop about 9 miles back, just past the county line. Rourke Auto." "And you're certain about what you're describing?" It wasn't really a question. He answered it anyway. "Yes, ma'am. I can get you running in about 20 minutes. I can't do a full repair out here in the rain, but I can bypass enough to get you home safe. Or I can call a flatbed if you'd prefer someone else to handle it." She looked at him for a long moment. The rain was getting harder. Somewhere out in the dark, a semi blew past and rocked the Meridian on its suspension. "Fix it," she said. Scots, Her name was Margaret Whitmore. He didn't know that yet. He found out when she handed him her AAA card by mistake. Old habit, she said, and then put it back in her wallet and didn't offer anything else. He didn't ask. He was on his back on the wet gravel with the maglite in his teeth and 2 fingers working a connector that had been very carefully, very deliberately, unclipped from its housing. Not yanked, not damaged, unclipped, with the kind of precision that took training. He thought about that while he worked. Whoever did this wasn't a vandal. A vandal cuts a wire, punches a sensor, does something obvious and angry. This was clinical. This was someone who understood the vehicle's architecture well enough to cause a failure that would look like an intermittent electronic fault, the kind of thing that might get diagnosed 3 times before someone found the real cause, if they ever did. 23 minutes later, the Meridian turned over. Margaret Whitmore sat in the driver's seat and listened to the engine idle. She lowered the window. "What do I owe you?" "Nothing." "Don't be ridiculous." "I'm not. You were stuck in the rain. I had the tools. It's fine." He was wiping his hands on a shop rag that was already past saving. "I'd take it to a dealership in the morning, though. They should document what was done to it. And you might want to tell whoever handles your security that the valet lot at the Alderton Club doesn't have great camera coverage on the east side." She looked at him with an expression he couldn't quite name. Not surprise, exactly. Something more like recalibration. "How would you know about the camera coverage?" "I don't. But east side parking positions at that kind of property usually face an alley or a service entry. That's where you lose coverage. It's where I'd go if I had to." Another long look. "Drive safe, ma'am." He walked back to his truck. Ethan's garage was called Rourke Auto, and the name was the most impressive thing about it. It sat on a strip of county road between a shuttered diner and a storage facility that rented space to people who couldn't throw things away. The building was a converted 2-bay service station from the 1970s, the kind with the steep roof and the faded paint you couldn't quite read anymore. Ethan had been leasing it for 6 years. The lift in the left bay made a sound like a dying animal every time it rose above 6 feet, and he'd learned to compensate by never trusting it above 5.5. He had 2 regular employees. One was a 19-year-old named Darius who was genuinely gifted with electrical systems and spent his lunch breaks watching engineering lectures on his phone. The other was a part-timer named Ray, who showed up 4 days a week, was good with brakes and suspension, and had the conversational style of a man who had decided words were a limited resource to be spent wisely. They made it work, some weeks better than others. Ethan lived in the attached office that he'd converted into something that almost resembled a living space, with a cot behind a partition and a real kitchen setup he'd installed himself. A 2-burner hot plate, a dorm fridge, a section of countertop he'd salvaged from a job site and sanded down. Lily lived with her grandmother, Ethan's mother, 20 minutes away in Dearborn. He had her every weekend and 2 evenings a week, and those were the hours he was a different person. The rest of the time, he was just the guy with the tools. He'd been something else, once. He didn't talk about it. No. He was under a 2018 Silverado the next morning, bad caliper, on the rear driver's side routine work, when Darius knocked on the undercarriage with his knuckle. "Ethan, Bone. Take a message." "She said you'd say that. She said to tell you it's about the Meridian." He rolled out from under the truck on his creeper board and sat up. Darius was holding out the shop phone with an expression that said he'd already decided this was interesting. Ethan took it. "This is Rourke." "Mr. Rourke." The voice on the other end was controlled, precise, the voice of someone who gave instructions for a living and expected them to be followed. "My name is Victoria Whitmore. I believe you assisted my mother last night on I-75. "I did." "She described what you found in the engine compartment." "Okay. I'd like to understand it better." A pause, short but deliberate. "What exactly did you find under my mother's hood, Mr. Rourke?" He looked at the Silverado. He looked at Darius, who was pretending to organize a rack of socket sets with tremendous focus. "A fuel authorization relay that had been manually disconnected," Ethan said. "Not damaged, disconnected. Someone who knew the vehicle's system bypassed the secondary ignition confirmation loop. It's designed to look like an electronic fault. Intermittent. Hard to trace. Silence on the other end. Not the silence of someone who didn't understand. The silence of someone processing something they'd been afraid to hear confirmed. And in your professional opinion, Mr. Rourke, could this have caused an accident rather than simply a breakdown? Ethan thought about that. Depends on the timing. The way it was set up, the car would lose starting function after a number of ignition cycles. But there are variations on the same technique that could affect systems while the vehicle is in motion. Stability control. Braking assist. He stopped. Whoever did what I found on your mother's car knew exactly what they were doing. Whether that's the full extent of what they did, I couldn't tell you without a full diagnostic. Another silence. Longer this time. I'd like you to come in, Victoria Whitmore said, to our facility, to look at some other vehicles. I'm a one-bay garage on a county road. I'm aware of where you work, Mr. Rourke. Something in her voice shifted, just slightly. Not warmer exactly, more direct. I'm also aware that you have a mechanical engineering degree from Michigan Tech, that you were a senior systems analyst at Drexler Automotive for 11 years, and that your employment there ended under circumstances that were contested. A beat. I do research before I invite people into my company. Ethan said nothing. I'm not interested in your past, she said. I'm interested in what you saw last night, and I think you might be able to help me understand something that's been keeping me up for 3 months. He stood up from the creeper board. His knees had been complaining for a year and a half. He ignored them, same as always. When? He said. Tomorrow morning. I'll send a car. I'll drive myself. A pause. Of course you will. 8 o'clock. I'll leave your name at the gate. The line went dead. Darius had stopped pretending to sort sockets. He was just looking at Ethan now, with open curiosity. Michigan Tech? He said. Finish the rear caliper, Ethan said, and don't scratch the rotor. Chab. He didn't sleep much that night. It wasn't the meeting that kept him up. It was the relay. He kept reconstructing it in his head. The precise angle of the disconnect, the specific component that had been targeted, the fact that whoever did it had chosen that approach instead of a dozen simpler ones that would have been less detectable. It matched something. That was the problem. The technique, the signature of it, the deliberate subtlety, the exploitation of a secondary system rather than a primary one, it matched a design philosophy Ethan had encountered before. Years ago, in a context that had nothing to do with Margaret Whitmore's luxury sedan. He didn't let himself finish that thought. Not yet. He was probably wrong. Pattern recognition was a useful tool and a dangerous one. And sometimes your brain found connections that weren't there because finding connections was what brains did. He got up at 5, made coffee on the 2-burner, and sat at the workbench with a notepad and a pen. He wrote down everything he'd observed under that hood. The component. The method. The timing mechanism's probable configuration. He drew a rough schematic from memory. Then he stared at it for a while. Then he drew a second schematic next to it. Older. From a different car, a different year, a different company. He set down the pen. They were the same, not similar. Not variations on a theme. The same underlying logic, the same exploitation of the same system architecture gap, executed with the same deliberate precision. Ethan sat there in the quiet of the garage, listening to the rain that had started up again outside, and felt something cold move through him that wasn't the weather. He'd seen this work before. He'd been blamed for it before. He folded the notepad and put it in his jacket pocket. He wasn't going to be able to sleep now regardless. He went and checked on the Silverado instead. The caliper was fine. Darius did good work. Outside, the rain came down on the county road and the broken sign and the rusted pump islands, and Ethan Rourke stood in the open bay door with his coffee going cold in his hand, looking at nothing and thinking about everything. He hadn't been back inside a corporate facility in 8 years, hadn't wanted to, had built something small and manageable and honest on a county road in Michigan and decided that was enough. But the schematic in his pocket said something different, said something he wasn't ready to say out loud yet, that the thing that had ended his life, the technical sabotage that had been blamed on him, that had taken his career and his reputation and almost his daughter, hadn't been a one-time crime. It had been a practice run. The Whitmore Motors campus sat off Telegraph Road behind a half-mile of manicured landscaping that probably cost more to maintain annually than Ethan made in 3 years. He drove past the main entrance twice before he found the visitor's gate, which was set back from the road and easy to miss if you weren't looking for it. A guard in a pressed uniform checked his name against a list on a tablet, handed him a laminated badge, and gave him directions to Building 7 with the particular tone of someone who'd been told to be helpful but hadn't been told to be warm. Ethan clipped the badge to his jacket pocket and drove through. The facility was bigger than it looked from the road. Research and development occupied a separate campus behind the main manufacturing hub. Newer buildings, better glass, the kind of architecture that said we are serious about the future in a way that regular factories didn't bother to. He parked in a visitor spot, checked that he had the notepad in his jacket, and got out. Victoria Whitmore was waiting in the lobby. That surprised him. He'd expected an assistant, a conference room, maybe 30 minutes of being processed before he got anywhere near anyone important. Instead, she was standing beside the reception desk in a charcoal suit with her arms crossed and her eyes on the door, like she'd been watching for him. She was younger than her voice had suggested. Early 40s, maybe. Dark hair cut short in a way that was either very deliberate or very practical, and he couldn't tell which. She had the particular stillness of someone who had learned to conserve energy in rooms full of people who wanted things from her. She didn't extend her hand right away. She looked at him first, taking inventory, same as he'd done with her mother on the highway. "Mr. Rourke." "Miss Whitmore." Then she offered her hand and they shook. Her grip was firm and brief. "I appreciate you coming." She said it like a statement of fact, not a pleasantry. "Walk with me." They didn't go to a conference room. She took him straight through a security door, down a corridor with polished floors and the particular hum of climate-controlled air, and into a testing bay that smelled like rubber and machine oil and the faint chemical undertone of new wiring insulation. Ethan's shoulders dropped about half an inch without him noticing. It smelled like work. It smelled like somewhere he understood. There were 4 vehicles in the bay, all prototypes by the look of them. The Apex 1, the vehicle he'd seen in the industry press, Whitmore's push into autonomous driving. Clean lines. Sensor arrays integrated into the body panels with more elegance than most manufacturers managed. The branding was minimal, just a small embossed logo near the B pillar. "Tell me what you see," Victoria said. Ethan walked to the nearest one. He looked at it for a moment without touching it, the way he always did, just looking, getting a sense of the thing. Then he circled it slowly. Victoria watched him without speaking. He appreciated that more than she probably knew. Most people filled silence. She didn't. He crouched near the front wheel well, took out his flashlight, and looked at the sensor housing. "Has your diagnostics team flagged anything on these vehicles recently?" "Yes." She came around to where he was crouching. "Over the past 6 weeks, we've had 11 separate diagnostic anomalies across 3 of the 4 prototypes. Our engineering team has attributed them to calibration drift in the sensor array and software sync errors during update cycles. They've logged them, adjusted parameters, moved on." "What kind of anomalies?" "Primarily in the collision avoidance system. The vehicle's perception layer was occasionally failing to register stationary objects at low speeds. Also some inconsistencies in the brake-by-wire response timing." Ethan stood up. He looked at her directly for the first time since they'd walked in. "And your engineering team is comfortable with that?" "My engineering team is under significant pressure to deliver this vehicle on schedule. A launch delay cost this company $40 million in pre-order penalties alone." She said it without bitterness, just precision. Being comfortable with something and being willing to fight a schedule over it are different things. He nodded slowly, then he turned back to the vehicle. "Can I get under the hood and into the system housing?" "I'll get you a tech." "I'd rather work alone." A pause. She studied him. "Why?" "Because if there's something in here that was put here by a person, and that person works in this facility, I'd rather not have someone looking over my shoulder while I find it." The silence that followed lasted about 4 seconds. Then Victoria said, I'll get you the access credentials. You'll have full diagnostic port access and the system housing keys. I'll be in my office on the second floor of this building. Call this number if you find something." She held out a business card. "Not the front desk. This number." He took the card. "And Mr. Rourke." She paused at the door. "My mother said you refused payment last night. It wasn't a big job." She also said you told her about the camera coverage at the valet lot. "I speculated about it." Victoria looked at him with an expression he still couldn't fully read. "My mother is a good judge of people. She has been for 78 years. She told me to trust you." She pushed the door open. "I'm not quite there yet, but I'm working on it." She left. Ethan put on a pair of nitrile gloves, pulled his notepad out of his pocket, and got to work. He spent 4 hours in that bay. No tech, no assistant, nobody walking through to check on him. Either Victoria was as good as her word or she was watching through the security cameras and had the sense to let him think he was alone. Either way, he worked the same way he always worked, methodically, quietly, from the outside in. The sensor arrays checked out on the first 2 vehicles. Calibration within normal range, no physical tampering, anomalies consistent with what the engineering team had said, software sync errors, probably genuine. He documented it and moved on. The third vehicle stopped him. He almost missed it. It was buried in the secondary layer of the collision avoidance module, in a section of code that handled the system's self-diagnostic reporting. Ethan wasn't a software engineer. His background was mechanical systems and hardware architecture, but he'd spent enough years at Drexler Automotive working at the intersection of mechanical and digital to read vehicle system code well enough to know when something didn't belong. What didn't belong was a small, elegant piece of embedded logic that told the system's diagnostic reporting module to suppress certain error flags before they were transmitted to the vehicle's data recorder. The errors themselves were still occurring. The system was still registering them internally, but the outward-facing diagnostic report was being cleaned up before anyone could read it. He sat back on his heels and stared at it. It was smart. It was very smart. In a standard diagnostic review, the vehicle would appear to be functioning within acceptable parameters. The internal error log, the one you only found if you went specifically looking for it, in a subsystem that wasn't part of standard review protocol, that was where the truth was. The system was failing in ways that it had been programmed to hide. He checked the fourth vehicle. Same embedded module. Same suppression logic. Ethan sat on the concrete floor of that testing bay and held very still for about 30 seconds. The design philosophy, the deliberate subtlety, the exploitation of a reporting gap rather than the system itself. The decision to make something look clean when it wasn't. Same as his notepad. Same as the Meridian on the highway. Same as what had destroyed his career at Drexler Automotive 8 years ago when a batch of vehicles had gone to market with a hidden calibration fault. And when the fault was discovered, the documentation trail had been manipulated to make it look like Ethan had falsified the safety certification. He pulled out Victoria's card and called the number. She picked up on the second ring. "Tell me," she said, without preamble. "You need to come down here." Victoria looked at what he showed her with the particular expression of someone who has been dreading being right. She didn't panic. She didn't make noise. She stood with her arms crossed and her jaw set, and she listened while Ethan walked her through it. The suppression module, the internal error flags, the way the system had been designed to present as healthy while concealing its own failures. "Who has access to the vehicle system architecture?" he asked. "Software team, hardware integration, 3 senior engineers, and the systems oversight group." She paused. "And board-level technical consultants. How many of those?" "Currently 2. Ethan waited. "Victor Halston," she said, and her voice changed very slightly when she said the name. Became more careful. "He joined the board 14 months ago. He brought in considerable investment capital and a background in automotive systems development." A beat. "And Marcus Vale, our company attorney. He's been advising on intellectual property protocol, which required technical system access for documentation purposes." Ethan kept his face neutral. "Halston, what did he do before joining your board?" "Consulting. Independent firm. Before that, He was VP of Systems Development at... She stopped. She looked at him. Drexler Automotive. The name landed in the bay like something dropped from a height. Ethan felt his chest tighten, not with surprise, with the particular sensation of a thing you'd suspected becoming a thing you knew. Mr. Rourke, Victoria's voice had gone very quiet. You worked at Drexler. Yes. And you were terminated. Yes. For falsifying safety certification documentation. He met her eyes. That's what they said. She studied him. The same inventory look from the lobby, but longer this time, more careful. Did you? No. Another silence. She made a decision. I believe you, she said. Not with warmth, with practicality, like someone accepting a weather report. What happened to the documentation at Drexler, the original safety files? Deleted. The backup server logs were corrupted. My workstation was the only clean source remaining, and those files had been modified before IT forensics got to them. He said it without visible emotion. He'd had 8 years to drain most of the feeling out of those facts. I couldn't prove the modification because the timestamps had been adjusted. Whoever did it understood the system well enough to cover it. The same person, Victoria said. It wasn't a question. I don't know that yet, but the methodology is identical. She uncrossed her arms, crossed them again. A small controlled gesture that told him she was working through something difficult. If you're right, if this is the same technique, the same person, then what happened to you at Drexler wasn't a separate incident. It was a test. That's what I think. A test for what they're doing here. Yes. Victoria walked to the nearest prototype and put her hand flat on the hood, not possessively, like she was checking whether it was still real. The Apex 1 launches in 4 months. We have 14,000 pre-orders. We're presenting the full safety certification package to the National Vehicle Safety Board in 6 weeks. She didn't look at him when she said it. If these failures are discovered during that review without explanation, if there's evidence that our prototypes have been hiding diagnostic errors, it doesn't just delay the launch. It ends the company. I know. And if they're not discovered and the vehicle launches with this suppression code embedded, people die, Ethan said. Eventually, not immediately. The failures are subtle enough that accidents would look like driver error or road conditions. But over enough miles, with enough vehicles, yes. Victoria turned away from the car. She looked at him straight on. I need to know who did this. Not suspicions, not theories, proof. I need a few things. Name them. Full access to the historical system logs, not the clean diagnostic reports, the raw internal logs going back to when these prototypes were first programmed. I need access to the facility's physical entry records for the testing bay. And I need someone outside your company, an independent analyst who can verify what I'm finding before we take it anywhere. I have someone in mind, Caleb Morgan. He does independent safety audits for federal vehicle certification reviews. He's worked with us before and he's not on anyone's payroll. She pulled out her phone. I'll call him today. Don't tell him what it's about on the phone. She looked up from the screen. If Halston has friends in this facility, Ethan said, he might have friends outside it. Until we know how deep this goes, the less you say over a line, the better. Victoria lowered the phone slowly. You think like someone who's been burned before. I was burned before. She nodded once. The access records and raw logs will be in a secure folder by this afternoon. I'll have a badge issued that gets you into this bay after hours. She stopped. I need to ask you something. Okay. Why are you doing this? She asked it without accusation. Just genuine curiosity, the kind that had a harder edge than it looked. You don't work for this company. You're not being paid. What happened to you at Drexler was 8 years ago. You could walk away from this building right now and go back to your garage and your life, and none of this would be your problem. Ethan thought about the notepad in his pocket, the 2 schematics side by side, looking like mirror images. He thought about the years after Drexler, the apartment he'd had to leave, the custody arrangement that had become complicated because he didn't have a steady income, the look on his daughter's face when he picked her up in the truck instead of the car they used to have. He thought about all of it, And then he thought about Margaret Whitmore standing in the rain on the highway with her phone held up to a sky that wasn't answering. Because the last time someone did this, he said, nobody caught them. And something is going to fail. Not might. Going to. And when it does, whoever's in that car won't know it's coming. Victoria held his gaze for a moment. Then she nodded, and this time it was different from the first one. Less calculation in it. I'll have everything ready by 4 o'clock, she said. He called Darius from the parking lot. How's the shop? Ray came in, we got the Tahoe done, and there's a Camry waiting on a water pump. You okay? I'm fine. I'm going to be out a few more hours. A pause. You want to tell me what's going on? Not yet. Because the woman who called yesterday, I looked up Whitmore Motors while you were gone, and Darius. Yeah. The Camry. Water pump. Right. He hung up and sat in the truck for a moment, watching the Whitmore campus through the windshield. A group of engineers in visitor badges crossed the parking lot, arguing about something in the animated, slightly irritable way of people who were actually working on a real problem. A delivery truck idled near the loading dock. Normal company activity. Everybody going about their day. Somewhere inside that building, probably at this exact moment, Victor Halston was going about his too. Ethan started the truck. He had raw system logs to read and not a lot of time to read them. And somewhere in those logs was the fingerprint of whoever had started all of this. At Drexler Automotive, 8 years ago, with a young engineer who'd made the mistake of being good enough at his job to get in the way. He wasn't good at many things outside of mechanical systems. He wasn't good at office politics or corporate maneuvering or playing the long game with people who had lawyers. He'd proven that already, proven it in the worst possible way. But he was very good at finding what was wrong with a machine. And right now, the machine he was trying to fix was bigger than anything he'd had under a hood before. It just ran on the same principles. Find the fault, trace it back to the source, and document everything. Whatever happened next, he was going to document everything. He pulled out of the visitor lot and onto Telegraph Road, and the Whitmore campus disappeared in his rearview mirror. He had 5 hours before Lily expected him for dinner. He drove with both hands on the wheel and the notepad on the seat beside him. And for the first time in a long time, the silence in the truck didn't feel like emptiness. It felt like something building. Caleb Morgan drove a 10-year-old Subaru with a cracked dashboard and a back seat full of binders. And he showed up to the Whitmore facility the following Tuesday, wearing a jacket that had seen better decades and carrying a hard-sided case that looked like it had been to federal hearings and back, which it had. He was 53, heavy-set in the way of someone who used to be athletic and had slowly stopped caring about it, with reading glasses pushed up on his forehead and the permanent slight squint of a man who spent most of his professional life staring at numbers that didn't add up. Victoria had briefed him in person, as Ethan had recommended. 30 minutes, closed door, no phones on the table. Caleb had listened without interrupting, which Victoria later told Ethan was unusual for him. When she was done, Caleb had said, "Show me the raw logs." That was all. No reaction, no commentary, just show me. Ethan liked him immediately. They worked out of the testing bay for 2 days. Victoria had cleared it of other personnel, a decision that generated some friction with her head of engineering, a man named Purcell who made no effort to hide his opinion that an outside mechanic being given unrestricted access to proprietary prototype systems was somewhere between professionally insulting and a corporate liability. He said as much to Victoria in the corridor outside the bay, in a voice loud enough that Ethan could hear it through the door. "You're handing a stranger the keys to 8 years of R&D because your mother got a flat tire." "My mother's car was sabotaged, Glenn." "You don't know that." "I do know that. I had it inspected independently after Mr. Rourke flagged it, and 2 separate technicians confirmed deliberate tampering. So yes, I know that." Her voice was completely level. "And Mr. Rourke found a suppression module in the Apex One's diagnostic reporting system that your team missed across 6 weeks of anomaly reviews, so I'd appreciate it if you saved the territorial posturing for after we figured out who put it there." A silence. Then Purcell's footsteps moving away down the corridor. Ethan went back to the logs. The raw internal records were dense. Millions of lines of system data across 4 vehicles and 8 months of testing cycles. Caleb had software that could parse the volume and flag anomalies against known baseline parameters. Ethan had his eyes and his memory and the methodical habit of someone who'd learned a long time ago that the detail you almost skipped was usually the one that mattered. They split the work without discussing how. Caleb ran the automated analysis. Ethan went through the flagged segments manually, cross-referencing timestamps against the facility access records Victoria had provided. It was slow. It was the kind of work that made your eyes burn around hour 6 and your lower back start sending formal complaints around hour 8. On the second day at just past 9 in the evening, Ethan found the entry point. It was in the access logs, a credential sign-in to the Vehicle System Architecture portal at 11:47 p.m. on a Thursday, 14 weeks ago. The credential belonged to a software engineer named Torres, who was listed as on approved medical leave at the time. The session had lasted 19 minutes and had accessed a specific subsystem within the collision avoidance module, the same subsystem where the suppression logic now lived. Caleb rolled his chair over and looked at the screen. He read it twice. Then he pulled his glasses down from his forehead. "The credential's been spoofed," he said. "That's what I think." Or Torres gave someone his login. Possible. But the access time is wrong for that. 11:47 p.m. Torres is on medical leave for a knee surgery. You don't hand someone your credentials at midnight from a hospital bed. Caleb took off his glasses entirely and rubbed his face with both hands. Someone used a legitimate credential to access the system at a time when the actual holder had an ironclad alibi, planted the suppression module, then logged out cleanly. He put his glasses back on. This is not amateur work. No. This is someone who understands the system architecture deeply enough to know exactly where to put something so it wouldn't show up in a standard review, who had either stolen access credentials or had enough system permissions to generate spoofed ones, and who specifically chose a timing window that covered their tracks. He looked at Ethan. How many people in this company have that level of access and that level of knowledge? Not many, but it doesn't have to be someone with all of that knowledge independently. It could be two people, one with system access, one with the technical knowledge to write the suppression module itself. Caleb was quiet for a moment. Like a board-level technical consultant and a company attorney with documented access to intellectual property systems. I didn't say that. You didn't have to. Caleb stood up and stretched his back with a sound like bubble wrap. We need the original source code of the suppression module traced. If it was written by someone specific, there are stylistic fingerprints in the code structure, variable naming conventions, comment syntax, logic architecture. It's not foolproof, but it narrows things. Can you do that? I know someone at the Automotive Safety Verification Institute who can. She's done code forensics for 3 federal investigations. He picked up his phone. I'll call her in the morning. Ethan saved the access log entry, duplicated it to an encrypted drive Victoria had provided, and leaned back in his chair. His neck hurt. The fluorescent lights in the testing bay had that particular quality that made 9 p.m. feel like 2 in the morning. He thought about Torres, a software engineer he'd never met, whose medical leave had been borrowed without his knowledge to commit what amounted to corporate sabotage. About how many other people in this building were involved without knowing it, their access, their names, their professional histories being picked up and used and put down by someone who decided the whole structure of this company was just a tool. His phone buzzed. A message from his mother. Lily asleep. She asked if you're coming Friday. She said to tell you she fixed the wheel on her bike herself. He looked at it for a moment. Then he typed back, "Tell her good. Tell her I'll be there Friday." He put the phone in his pocket and went back to work. The code forensics came back in 4 days. Caleb's contact, a woman named Dr. Reyes, who communicated exclusively through a secure document portal and apparently slept about 4 hours a night, delivered a 40-page technical analysis with her name on the cover page and a note at the top that said preliminary findings, subject to full review, not for legal submission without further authentication. Below that, in plain language that had clearly been added as an afterthought for non-specialists, she'd written, "The embedded module shares structural and syntactic characteristics with code developed at Drexler Automotive between 2009 and 2016, specifically within the Vehicle Systems Diagnostics Division. The logic architecture matches internally documented development patterns from that division with approximately 87% confidence. Ethan read that sentence 3 times, standing in the testing bay with the report in his hands. He brought it to Victoria's office. She read the relevant section twice, then set it down on her desk with both palms flat on the paper. Victor Halston ran the Vehicle Systems Diagnostics Division at Drexler from 2010 to 2015, she said. I know. I worked under him for 2 years. She looked up. You reported to Halston. Not directly. He was 3 levels above me. But I knew his work. I knew the design philosophy. Ethan sat down across from her without being invited. When the safety certification issue came up at Drexler, when they needed someone to blame, Halston was on the oversight committee that reviewed the evidence. Victoria was very still. He helped design the investigation into something he built. And I was the junior engineer with the least protection and the most proximity to the compromised system. I had access to the certification files. I had the technical knowledge to have done it. He paused. I also had no money for a legal defense and no corporate relationships worth protecting. I was a good candidate. Victoria stood up and walked to the window. Outside, the Whitmore campus was doing its ordinary afternoon business. Employees crossing between buildings, a delivery cart moving along the service road, everything functioning the way it was supposed to on the surface. Why here? She said. Why come after Whitmore Motors? What does Halston gain? The Apex One technology. Ethan had been thinking about this for days. If the launch fails, if the vehicle goes to market with hidden safety failures, and those failures cause incidents, Whitmore Motors faces federal investigation, massive liability, and a stock collapse. In that environment, the company becomes vulnerable to acquisition or hostile restructuring. Someone with insider knowledge of the technology, the right investment position, and existing board influence could acquire the core IP and the talent base for a fraction of its current value. He looked at her. That's what this has always been about. Not destroying the company, buying it cheaply, after creating the conditions that make it cheap. Victoria turned from the window. Her face was controlled, but there was something working behind her eyes, something that had been working there since the parking lot outside the testing bay 3 days ago and was now getting close to a conclusion. Marcus Vale, she said, our attorney. He has access to the company's IP documentation, the board's financial disclosure filings, and the legal structure of our shareholder agreements. If someone wanted to execute a technical acquisition play, know exactly where the vulnerabilities were, understand the legal architecture of a hostile move, you'd want someone exactly where Vale is. He's been with this company for 6 years. Halston joined 14 months ago. That's when the clock started. Ethan leaned forward. I think Vale was already here, waiting. Halston joined when the Apex One was close enough to launch that the timing made sense. The sabotage was inserted 14 weeks ago, when the vehicle was deep enough into testing that an anomaly pattern would look like late-stage development issues, not deliberate interference. Victoria sat back down. She picked up a pen and held it without using it. We need to take this to the board. Not yet. She looked at him sharply. The access log and the code forensics are strong, he said, but they're not enough to prove intent. What we have shows that someone with Halston's background likely wrote the suppression module and that it was inserted via a spoofed credential. A good attorney, and Vale is a very good attorney, will argue that the code similarity is coincidence, that the credential access was a security breach by an unknown third party, and that any suggestion of conspiracy is speculation from a disgraced former Drexler engineer with a documented grudge against the company that ended his career. He stopped. They already have the counter-narrative. They've been building it for years. Mine. Victoria set down the pen. What else do we need? The original credential theft. How did they get Torres's login information? That's going to leave a trace somewhere, either in the network access records or in Torres's own account activity in the weeks before the unauthorized session. If we can show that someone accessed Torres's credential storage before that midnight login, we have a chain of action, not just a pattern of similarity. That's IT forensics. I'll need to involve my head of IT security. Is she someone you trust? Victoria considered that for a moment. Yes. She's been here 11 years and she has no relationship with Halston. Then bring her in, quietly, and only her. You're very careful for a small garage mechanic. I'm careful because the last time I wasn't, I lost everything. He said it without particular heat. Just fact. I'm not losing this one. She held his gaze for a second. Then she picked up the phone. The IT forensics took another 5 days. And during those 5 days, Ethan drove back to Rourke Auto every evening and worked the shop during daylight hours because the bills didn't pause for corporate conspiracies. Darius had figured out that something significant was happening. He'd found a Whitmore Motors press kit on Ethan's desk and made a series of careful observations that he kept almost entirely to himself, which Ethan appreciated. Ray continued to say very little. The Camry got its water pump. A school bus came in with a transmission issue that ate 2 days. On the third evening, Ethan picked up Lily from his mother's house, and they ate dinner at the kitchen table. Real plates, not the diner containers he sometimes defaulted to when it was just him. And Lily told him about a science project she was doing on how engines worked, which she'd started, she said, because she wanted to understand what he did all day. "Do you like fixing things?" she asked. She was 9. She asked questions in that direct way kids had before they learned to soften everything. "Yeah," he said, "I do." "Why?" He thought about it. "Because a machine tells you the truth. If something's wrong, it shows you. You just have to look in the right place." She considered this with the focused expression she'd inherited from her mother, which sometimes caught him off guard. What if you look in the right place and you still can't fix it? Then you look in a different place. She seemed satisfied with that. They finished dinner and he helped her with the science project for an hour. And when he drove back to the garage that night, the truck felt different, quieter. He left the radio off, same as always, but the silence had a different quality. On the 5th day, Victoria's head of IT security, a compact, precise woman named Ingram, who communicated in short declarative sentences and had clearly been told only as much as she needed to know, delivered her findings in a folder with a handwritten index on the inside cover. 3 weeks before the unauthorized midnight session, someone had accessed the IT infrastructure management console, using a set of administrative credentials belonging to a legacy account that should have been deactivated 18 months earlier. The legacy account had been kept active in error, a maintenance oversight, and someone had known it was there and had used it to access the credential vault where active user login tokens were stored. From there, they'd pulled Torres's active session token and used it to authenticate the 11:47 p.m. system access. The administrative console access had come from inside the building, from a workstation in the executive suite on the 4th floor. Victor Halston's office was on the 4th floor. Ingram had not been told whose office it was. She'd simply identified the workstation and logged its location. But the building floor plan was on the table between them, and when Ethan put his finger on the workstation location and Victoria found the corresponding office on the plan, neither of them said anything for a moment. "This is the chain," Ethan said finally. "Legacy admin account accesses the credential vault. Credential vault gives up Torres's token. Torres's token authenticates the midnight session. Midnight session implants the suppression module. The module hides the Apex One's failures from every review conducted since." He looked at Ingram. "Can you verify that the workstation access came from a physical login rather than a remote session?" Ingram nodded. "Physical login. Card key access to the executive suite confirms someone was in that area of the building at the time of the console access. The card used was registered to Victor Halston." Victoria set down the floor plan very carefully, the way you set down something fragile. "We have him," she said. "We have most of him." Ethan pulled the forensics report across the table. "We still need to connect Vale. The suppression module was written with coding characteristics matching Halston's background, but Vale's role in this isn't technical, it's strategic. His connection is going to be harder to document." "How do you prove strategy?" Ingram asked. "You look for communication, coordination, anything that shows they were acting together rather than independently." He looked at Victoria. "Vale has access to board communications, shareholder documentation, acquisition structures. If he was preparing the legal framework for a post-collapse takeover, there are documents. They might be outside company systems, private accounts, external servers. But people make mistakes. They send things through channels they assume are safe." Victoria stood up. She walked to the window again. She did that, he'd noticed, when she was working through something she didn't want to say yet. I have a relationship with a contact at the Federal Vehicle Safety Bureau, someone I trust. If I bring this to them now, they can issue a preservation order that freezes Halston and Vale's communications before they have any warning to clean them up. Ethan thought about it. It was a risk. A federal inquiry meant losing control of the process, meant exposure, meant that things moved according to other people's timelines. But it was also the cleanest chain of custody for the evidence they had. Federal preservation meant the documentation couldn't be challenged as selectively gathered. If you make that call, he said, it has to happen before Halston knows we're looking at him. Once he knows, the clock runs out fast. How long do you need to prepare everything we have into a single presentable package? A day. Maybe 2. Victoria turned from the window. Then you have a day. He worked through this night in the testing bay. Not dramatically. Not the way you'd write it if you were trying to make it cinematic. He sat at a workstation with a coffee that went cold and a legal pad that filled up and a methodical habit he'd been building for 20 years, and he assembled everything they had into a coherent evidentiary sequence. The Meridian sabotage photographs, the suppression module documentation, the code forensics report from Dr. Reyes, the access log with the midnight credential session, the IT forensics tracing the path from the legacy admin account to the 4th floor workstation, Ingram's card key confirmation. Caleb stopped by at midnight with sandwiches from a gas station and reviewed the sequence with him for 2 hours, checking for gaps the way you'd pressure test a fuel line, systematically, looking for the exact point where it would fail. There were weak points. The code forensics were probabilistic, not definitive. The connection between Halston's physical office location and the workstation access was strong but not impossible to dispute. A defense attorney would argue that someone else could have used his card key or that the card access logs had their own integrity questions, and Vale was still a gap, a significant gap. This is enough to start an investigation, Caleb said, finishing the last of his sandwich. It's probably not enough to end one. Not yet. I know. But a federal preservation order buys time, and once their communications are frozen, if there's anything in those messages, there will be. Ethan said it with a certainty that wasn't bravado. It was logic. Halston has been running this play for a long time. Drexler, now here. A scheme that complex, that long in the building, doesn't exist only in 2 people's heads. There are records somewhere. There always are. People write things down. People send emails they shouldn't. They think they're protected, and they get sloppy. He closed the legal pad. That's the thing about people who do this kind of thing. They're careful about the technical part. They plan the technical part meticulously, but they underestimate documentation. Caleb looked at him. Because they've never been caught on the documentation before. Because they framed someone else for the documentation problem. They never had to face it themselves. Ethan gathered the files into a folder. I spent 8 years being the answer to their documentation problem. I know exactly what that feels like from the other side. Caleb was quiet for a moment. Outside the testing bay, the building was completely still. The Apex 1 prototypes sat in their spaces under the overhead lights, clean and silent, carrying their hidden failures with no outward sign that anything was wrong. You know they're going to come after you again, Caleb said. When Halston figures out what's happening, his first move is going to be your history, Drexler, the termination. He'll put it in front of every camera he can find and make you look like a disgruntled ex-employee who's been carrying a grudge for 8 years. I know. And some people will believe it. Some people believed it the first time. Ethan zipped the folder closed. The difference this time is the evidence doesn't go through him. It goes around him. He turned off the workstation. The testing bay lights hummed. He thought about the schematic he'd drawn on his notepad the night after the highway. The 2 diagrams side by side. The technical signature that had followed him across 8 years and 2 companies like a stain he couldn't identify the source of until now. He thought about what it meant that someone had done this before, had ruined a man's life as a proof of concept, and then waited and planned and done it again on a much larger scale with much higher stakes. And he thought about the fact that the only reason any of it was unraveling right now was a 78-year-old woman standing in the rain on a dark highway and a truck that happened to pass at the right moment, driven by someone who knew what a deliberate fault looked like because he'd been blamed for one. He picked up the folder and turned off the light. Victoria made the call to her Federal Vehicle Safety Bureau contact at 7 in the morning, standing in her car in the parking garage beneath her building, because it was the only place she was certain had no active listening devices she hadn't personally verified. The contact's name was Adrienne Cho, and she'd been with the FVSB for 16 years. And when Victoria finished laying out the summary, she said two things. The first was that she needed to see the documentation before she could authorize a preservation order. The second was that Victoria should assume, from this point forward, that anything discussed inside Whitmore Motors' walls might find its way back to the people they were discussing. Victoria drove to the facility with that thought sitting in the passenger seat. She'd sent Ethan the message at 6:45. Federal contact engaged. Bringing materials to her office at noon. Do not discuss further in the building. His reply came back in under 3 minutes. Understood. Watch your calendar today. She didn't know what he meant by that until 9:15, when her assistant knocked on her office door and told her that Victor Halston had called an emergency board meeting for 2 o'clock that afternoon. She sat with that information for a moment. Then she typed back to Ethan. He's moving faster than we expected. The reply, or exactly as fast as he expected to have to. Do you have everything backed up off-site? She did. She'd spent an hour the previous night transferring encrypted copies of every file to a remote server Ingram had set up specifically for the purpose, air-gapped from Whitmore's main network. But the board meeting changed the calculation. If Halston was calling an emergency session, he'd decided to accelerate, which meant something had shifted in his timeline. Either he'd sensed movement against him, or he'd simply decided the window was right and the moment was now. She forwarded the meeting notification to Ethan and called Caleb Morgan from the parking garage again. He's calling the board at 2, she said. Today? Today. A pause. Caleb's breathing on the line. Your federal contact can't move fast enough for a preservation order to be in place by 2 o'clock. No, she can't. So whatever Halston is planning to do in that room, he's going to do it without the federal process being active. Yes. Victoria, Caleb's voice was careful. If he moves to restructure board authority before the preservation order goes through, the legal complexity of freezing communications becomes significantly harder. Vail will have had time to architect whatever comes next, and if they've already moved assets or created structural changes to the board, I know what it means, Caleb. She wasn't sharp with him. She just needed him to stop explaining the problem and help her think about the solution. What can we bring into that room at 2 o'clock that holds up without federal authorization? A longer pause this time. The physical evidence, the access logs, the code forensics, Ingram's findings, those aren't under any legal challenge yet. They're internal documents generated by company systems for legitimate investigative purposes. Your right to produce them in a board meeting isn't contingent on federal process. And Halston's legal counter-argument? Vail will say they're selectively gathered and improperly obtained. He'll question the chain of custody. He'll argue that Ethan Rourke, a man with a documented termination from a company connected to Halston, who was brought in without board approval and given access to proprietary systems, is a compromised investigator with a personal motive. And what's our answer to that? Caleb was quiet for a moment. Margaret Whitmore. Victoria closed her eyes briefly. She's 78 years old and she's been through enough. She's also the person who can establish, with first-hand testimony, that the vehicle's sabotage predated Ethan Rourke's involvement by at least 24 hours. She removes the contamination argument. If she's in that room, Vail can't build the narrative that Rourke planted or manipulated what he found. The foundation of their defense is that he's the bad actor. Your mother cuts that foundation out from under them. Victoria opened her eyes. The concrete ceiling of the parking garage was gray and water-stained and about as far from the world she'd built as anything she could look at. She thought about calling her mother and asking her to walk into a boardroom full of hostile men and testify about her own damaged car. And she thought about the fact that her mother had been standing in the rain for 20 minutes on a dark highway before a stranger stopped, and how she'd handled that with complete composure. "I'll call her," Victoria said. Ethan was at Rourke Auto when Victoria's second message came through, the one that said, "Mother is coming. Meeting is at 2. You need to be there. He read it standing at his workbench with grease on his left hand and a coolant line for a Dodge pickup on the bench in front of him. He looked at the coolant line for a moment. Then he looked at Ray, who was in the other bay working on brake pads. "Ray, can you finish the Dodge?" Ray looked over. "What year?" 14. "Yeah." Ethan washed his hands, changed his shirt. He kept a clean one in the office, an old habit from the Drexler years, and called Darius while he was driving, which he almost never did. "I need you to cover the front desk until Ray's done with the Dodge. There's a Kia coming in at 3 for an oil change. It's on the schedule." "What's happening?" Darius asked. "Something I've been working on." "The Whitmore thing." Ethan didn't answer that. "Ethan, I've been watching you leave here in a clean shirt 3 times this week. The Whitmore thing. Cover the front desk." He hung up and drove. Bam. He arrived at Whitmore Motors at 12:50. The lobby felt different than it had on the first day. Or maybe he was moving through it differently. He didn't wait at reception this time. His badge still worked, and Victoria had sent word ahead. He took the elevator to the 4th floor, which he'd never been to before, and found the executive wing with its good carpet and its closed doors and its quiet that was different from the testing bay's quiet. The testing bay was quiet because people were working. This floor was quiet in the way of places where decisions got made, and the noise came later. Victoria met him outside the boardroom door. She looked like she'd slept about as much as he had, which was not enough. "My mother's already inside," she said. "How is she?" Annoyed that we're treating this like a thing she needs to be prepared for. That was almost reassuring. "Halston and Vale?" Ethan asked. "In the building. Vale was in his office 20 minutes ago. Halston arrived at 12:30. She dropped her voice even lower. "Purcell has been in the building since 7. He came in before the meeting notification went out." Ethan absorbed that. Purcell, her head of engineering, the one who'd stood in the corridor and complained about a stranger being given access to proprietary systems. How close is Purcell to Halston? "I don't know. I'm choosing to worry about that after 2 o'clock. That was probably the right order of priorities. "What's the meeting framed as?" Halston called it an emergency session for a review of executive decision-making regarding the Apex 1 launch timeline and what he's calling, in the formal notice, concerns about unauthorized external consultation affecting proprietary research security. She looked at him steadily. "That's you. He knows I've been here. He's known for at least a week, I think. He just waited until he was ready to move." She straightened up from the wall. The meeting notice went to all 12 board members. 8 of them confirmed attendance. The other 4 are participating remotely. "How many of the 12 do you trust?" 4 without question. 3 more who I think will follow the evidence if we present it clearly. The others I'm less certain about. She paused. "Halston needs a majority to push through any governance change. That's 7 votes. If he has Purcell, and apparently he has Purcell, he needs 5 more from the board. Does he have them? I don't know. He wouldn't be calling this meeting if he didn't think he did." The boardroom door was heavy glass and dark wood, and through it Ethan could see the long table and the people already seated. Board members he didn't know, a few faces he half recognized from company materials. And at the far end, already seated with papers in front of him, Victor Halston. Ethan looked at him through the glass. He hadn't seen the man in 8 years. He'd aged the way some men did. Not badly, not well, just more of whatever they already were. Halston had always had the particular confidence of someone who believed that the architecture of a situation was always something he understood better than the other people in the room. He looked like he still believed that. "One more thing," Victoria said quietly. "Adrienne Cho at the FVSB. She reviewed the materials I sent at noon. She can't issue a preservation order without a full formal submission, but she told me that what we sent her is, in her words, materially significant and warrants immediate attention. She's putting together an emergency review request on her end. It won't move by 2 o'clock, but it's moving." Ethan nodded. "Then let's go in." Bam-tum. The boardroom had 12 seats around the table and a screen at one end and a credenza along the wall with coffee nobody was touching. Ethan walked in behind Victoria, which put him in immediate view of everyone at the table. and he felt the shift in the room's energy, the thing that happened when the presence of a specific person confirmed what people had been told to expect. Halston looked at him. It was a steady look, measured and unsurprised, the look of someone checking a variable against a prediction. Marcus Vale was seated to Halston's left. He was younger than Ethan had expected, early 50s, lean in the careful way of a man who exercised for professional reasons, with the kind of practice-neutral expression that good litigators wore like a second skin. He glanced at Ethan once and looked away, which was its own kind of message. Margaret Whitmore was seated 3 chairs to the right of the head of the table. She was wearing a different good wool coat, charcoal this time, and her hands were folded on the table in front of her with the patience of someone who had sat through a great many rooms full of men deciding things and had developed a completely accurate read of which ones were worth her time and which weren't. She met Ethan's eyes when he came in and gave him a short nod. He returned it. Halston opened when the remote board members were confirmed on screen. Thank you all for making time on short notice. I want to be direct about what this meeting is, because I think directness serves everyone better than agenda management. Over the past 2.5 weeks, our CEO has brought an external individual into this facility, granted him unsupervised access to proprietary prototype systems, and initiated what appears to be an internal investigation without board authorization, without legal oversight, and without disclosure to the board's technical advisory committee. He paused. The external individual in question is Ethan Rourke, a former automotive engineer who was terminated from Drexler Automotive for falsifying federal safety documentation. I'd like the board to understand the nature of the risk this has created before we discuss the path forward. Nobody spoke immediately. Ethan counted 3 seconds. Mr. Halston, Victoria's voice was level. You've characterized the situation. I'd like to respond to it. You'll have the opportunity. I'll respond now. Thank you. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. Mr. Rourke was brought into this facility because he identified deliberate technical sabotage in my mother's vehicle that our own security team had not flagged. He was subsequently given access to the Apex One prototypes because he identified a system anomaly in the vehicle's diagnostic reporting architecture that our engineering team had attributed to calibration drift across 6 weeks of review. She let that sit for a moment. The anomaly was not calibration drift. It was an embedded suppression module designed to hide active safety failures from external diagnostic review. Mr. Rourke found it in under 4 hours. The room absorbed that. One of the remote board members, a woman with gray hair and reading glasses, leaned slightly toward her camera. What kind of safety failures? She asked. Collision avoidance inconsistencies and brake-by-wire response anomalies. The kind of failures that, in a deployed autonomous vehicle at scale, would eventually produce accidents that would appear to investigators as driver error or road conditions. Vale spoke for the first time. His voice was smooth and well-practiced and had no audible stress in it. I want to flag for the board that what's being described is a very serious allegation that, as of this moment, rests entirely on analysis produced by an individual with a documented history of manipulating automotive safety systems, who was then given unsupervised access to exactly the systems he's now claiming someone else tampered with. Ethan had expected that. He'd been waiting for it the way you wait for a noise you know is coming so it doesn't startle you. I'd like to present the documentation, he said. It was the first time he'd spoken, and he kept it short. Vale looked at him with the particular expression of an attorney who has decided to let something proceed because stopping it would look worse than allowing it. By all means. Ethan opened the folder on the table in front of him. He'd organized it the night before, not for drama, just for clarity, because clarity was the only thing he actually had, and he needed it to land in the right sequence. He walked them through it the way he would have explained a fault to a customer. This is what the system was doing. This is where the fault was. This is how it got there. He put the access log on the screen, timestamp, credential, system accessed. He put the IT forensics beside it, the legacy admin account, the credential vault access, the workstation location on the 4th floor of this building. The workstation that accessed the credential vault, which was then used to implant the suppression module, is physically located in the executive suite on the 4th floor of this building, Ethan said. The card key access log for the executive suite shows one entry in the relevant time window at 11:31 p.m., 16 minutes before the credential vault access began. He looked at the screen. The card key used was registered to Victor Halston. The room shifted. It was subtle. People didn't stand up or make noise, but there was a quality change in the air, the way a room changes when something that was abstract becomes specific. Halston's expression didn't break. He'd prepared for this. Card keys are not biometric. Anyone with access to my card could have used it. That's true, Ethan said, which is why the card key access is not the primary evidence. It's corroborating. He put the code forensics report on the screen. Dr. Reyes's analysis establishes that the suppression module was written using logic architecture and coding conventions consistent with work developed in the Drexler Automotive Vehicle Systems Diagnostics Division between 2009 and 2015. The confidence interval is 87%. He looked at Halston. You ran that division from 2010 to 2015. For the first time, something moved across Halston's face. Not fear. More like recalibration. The same look, Ethan thought, that Victoria had made in the testing bay when she found out he'd worked under Halston. The look of someone adjusting their model of the situation. Vale put both hands flat on the table. Coding style analysis is not forensic proof. 87% confidence is not certainty. What you're presenting is circumstantial correlation between a coding style and a former employer, presented by a man who has personal grievances against that former employer. The grievances are real, Ethan said. He didn't argue the point. I was terminated from Drexler Automotive 8 years ago for a safety documentation failure that was attributed to me. I did not commit that failure. The technical signature of the sabotage that ended my career at Drexler Automotive is identical in design philosophy to the suppression module found in the Apex 1 prototypes. He pulled out the last page, the side-by-side schematic he'd drawn from memory on his notepad the night after the highway, which Caleb had then verified against the technical documentation. Same exploitation of a secondary reporting system, same suppression logic, same architectural approach to hiding an active fault while maintaining outward diagnostic health. That proves nothing about who it proves, Ethan said, that the same person who built the system that destroyed my career is the person who built the system in that vehicle. He paused. And the only person in this room who was at Drexler Automotive in a position to build that system, and is now at Whitmore Motors in a position to deploy it here, is sitting across this table. The silence was different this time, heavier. Margaret Whitmore spoke. She didn't raise her hand or ask permission. She simply spoke, the way someone speaks when they've decided they've heard enough preamble. I would like to say something. Every head in the room turned to her. My vehicle was inspected by 2 independent technicians after Mr. Rourke brought the tampering to my daughter's attention. Both confirmed that the ignition relay had been manually disconnected in a deliberate and technically sophisticated manner. She looked around the table with the measured gaze of someone who has lived long enough not to be impressed by a room. The Alderton Club valet lot where my vehicle was parked the day before this occurred, I checked with the club's management. The east side valet positions, which is where my vehicle was parked, have a known camera gap on the alley side. That gap has been documented in the club's own security review. She paused. Mr. Rourke identified that gap from inference alone, based on his understanding of how tampering is typically executed. He'd never been to that club in his life. He described what someone who intended to tamper with my vehicle would look for, and he was exactly right. She folded her hands again. I am not a technical person. I can't evaluate schematics or access logs. What I can tell you is that Mr. Rourke's understanding of how this was done proved accurate in every detail before he had any evidence. That is not the profile of someone who planted what he found. The gray-haired board member on the remote screen had taken off her glasses. Mr. Halston, I'd like to hear your response to the access log and the IT forensics findings. Halston looked at the screen with complete composure. I believe there has been a significant security breach of Whitmore Motors' IT infrastructure by an as-yet unidentified external party who exploited a legacy administrative account and used my card key, which I reported as misplaced 2 months ago, a report that exists in the security log, to conduct unauthorized access and plant both the malicious module and the appearance of my involvement. He'd prepared that. It was clean. It acknowledged the evidence and built an alternative explanation in a single breath. Ethan had known it was coming, but hearing it delivered that smoothly was still something. "The security log report for your missing card key," Victoria said. "Can you point us to the date of that report?" A beat. Just one beat too long. "I'd need to verify the exact date with security." "I can verify it," Ingram said from her seat at the side of the room. Victoria had brought her in, introduced as the head of IT security, which Vale had objected to briefly before being overruled. "Mr. Halston did not report a missing card key in the past 6 months. There is no such report in the security system." The beat that followed was longer than one. Vale put his hand on Halston's arm, which was the clearest signal Ethan had seen in the room, clearer than any document, because it was instinct. It said, "Stop talking in the universal language of attorneys who see a situation changing shape." Halston stopped talking. The gray-haired board member said, "I'd like to move that we table any governance discussion until an independent review of these materials has been conducted." 2 other board members seconded it before she'd finished the sentence. Halston's 5 votes, whatever they'd been, whoever he'd lined up in the days before this meeting, were not visible now. People who'd been watching a plan work had stopped watching a plan work, and the room had shifted the way rooms shifted when the audience decided they were on the wrong side of history. Vale said something quietly to Halston. Halston listened. His face had gone to a careful neutral that Ethan recognized. It was the face of someone doing rapid damage assessment, not the face of someone who was done. "Mr. Halston," Victoria said, "I'm going to ask that you and Mr. Vale remain in the building pending a formal security review. Ingram, please coordinate with the security team." She looked at the room. "I also want the board to know that this morning I provided a complete evidence package to the Federal Vehicle Safety Bureau, which is initiating an expedited review. I did this because the safety of the Apex One involves federal certification, and anything that affects that certification is appropriately a federal matter." She paused. "I should have done it sooner. That's on me." Nobody argued with that. The board meeting that Halston had called to remove Victoria from her own company's table had become the meeting where he couldn't explain why a card key he'd never reported missing had opened a door to a room where someone stole an engineer's credentials to hide a bomb inside a car's. Ethan left the boardroom at 4:15. He didn't wait for the formal adjournment. Victoria had it. The board members were asking the right questions, and he was no longer the most useful person in that room. He'd been the most useful person in the testing bay, and in the parking lot at night with a yellow mag light, and at a workbench at 2 in the morning with a legal pad. Boardrooms were someone else's terrain. He took the elevator down, walked through the lobby, pushed through the glass doors, and stood outside in the afternoon air, which was cold and smelled like rain coming and was significantly better than recirculated fourth-floor air. His jacket wasn't warm enough for the temperature, but he stood there anyway. His phone buzzed. Darius. He answered it. "Kia's done," Darius said. "Also, Ray wants to know if you're coming back tomorrow." "Yeah, I'm coming back." "Okay. Also, there's a message from some woman named Margaret saying to call her at your earliest convenience, which I'm pretty sure is old people for call me right now." Ethan almost laughed. It came out as a sound that was at least in the vicinity of one. "I'll call her." "You going to tell me what happened today?" He looked back at the Whitmore building. 12 floors of glass reflecting a gray Michigan sky, same as it had been when he drove in that morning. Same building. Different room than the one Halston had planned on. "Eventually," he said. "When it's done." He hung up and walked to his truck. The rain that had been threatening all day started while he was crossing the parking lot. Not a storm, just a steady cold drizzle, the kind that settled in and meant business. He got in and sat for a moment, his hands on the wheel. His name had been said in that boardroom today, said as evidence, as testimony, as something that mattered, not as the explanation for what had gone wrong, as the person who'd found what was wrong and documented it, and stood in front of 12 people in a screen full of faces and said, "Here it is, here's how it happened, here's who did it." He'd done that before, or tried to. 8 years ago in a different boardroom, in a different city, with no documentation and no allies and no one willing to stand still long enough to listen. He'd failed that day in the way you fail when the structure around you is already built to make you fail. The structure today had been different, and he'd built part of it himself, on a workbench in a testing bay at 2 in the morning with a gas station sandwich and a man who checked his logic like a pressure test on a fuel line. Ethan started the truck. He pulled out of the visitor's lot and onto Telegraph Road and drove back toward the county line, back toward Rourke Auto, and the lift that made a dying animal sound above 5.5 feet, and the sign out front that nobody could read anymore. The drizzle came down on the windshield and the wipers moved at their usual pace, and he drove in the silence he always drove in. Except this time the silence had a weight to it that was different from what he was used to. Not the weight of things unresolved. The weight of something that had been wrong for a very long time and was, for the first time, beginning to be corrected. He wasn't done. He knew that. Halston had lawyers and resources and the practiced resilience of someone who'd built his career on not being the person who took the fall. Vail would file motions and challenge chain of custody and work every procedural angle available, which were many. The federal review would take months. There would be depositions and counter-narratives, and days when the whole thing would feel uncertain again. But the evidence was documented. The evidence was out of his hands now, and in the hands of people whose job was to do something with it. And that was the thing he'd never had before. The last time he'd faced it alone, with nothing on paper that hadn't been altered before anyone could read it. This time was different. He drove past the shuttered diner and pulled into the lot at Rourke Auto. The lights were on inside. Through the bay window, he could see Darius at the workbench, doing something with a multimeter, learning something the same way he always learned things, on his own time, by doing it. Ethan sat in the truck for a moment in the rain. Then he got out and went back to work. The federal preservation order came through at 9:17 the following morning. Ethan was under a Buick LeSabre with a failing exhaust manifold when Darius knocked on the undercarriage, and when he rolled out and read Victoria's message on his phone, he sat on the creeper board for a moment without moving. Adrienne Cho's team had worked through the night. The order froze all digital communications, financial records, and documentation associated with Victor Halston and Marcus Vail, personal accounts, external servers, encrypted messaging applications, as of 6 a.m. Anything they tried to move or delete in the hours since the boardroom meeting was now recoverable under federal evidence protocol. He typed back, "Good." 2 letters. He didn't have more than that right now. He went back under the Buick. The next 3 weeks were not a resolution. They were a grind, which is what the truth usually was when it finally started moving. Not a clean sweep, not a moment of dramatic vindication, but an accumulating weight of documentation and testimony and procedural machinery that moved at its own pace and didn't particularly care how much pressure you were under or how long you'd been waiting. Ethan had known this was how it would go. He'd watched the Drexler investigation run its course 8 years ago, watched it from the wrong side, as the subject rather than the witness, and he understood that systems designed to establish truth were also systems designed to be slow, because speed was how you missed things, and missing things had consequences. So he worked the shop during the day and answered federal investigators' questions in the evenings and drove to Dearborn on Friday nights to have dinner with Lily and his mother. And he did not watch the news coverage, because the news coverage was something else entirely. The leak came on a Thursday, 11 days after the board meeting. Ethan didn't know who originated it. Vail's people, Halston's attorney, a disgruntled source inside Whitmore Motors, someone who'd been paid to move the story into the open before the federal review could shape the narrative. It didn't matter who. What mattered was that by Thursday evening, 3 automotive industry outlets and 1 national news network had published versions of the same story, that an internal dispute at Whitmore Motors had resulted in a disgraced former engineer, terminated for safety fraud at Drexler Automotive, being given access to the company's most sensitive proprietary systems, and that questions were being raised about whether the investigation into board member Victor Halston was itself a manufactured crisis designed to deflect from the CEO's mismanagement of the Apex One launch. Ethan read it on his phone at the kitchen table, alone, with a cup of coffee. He read the whole thing. He didn't skim. He read every paragraph, including the one that quoted a source described as a senior Whitmore Motors executive saying that Ethan Rourke had a well-documented history of targeting systems he didn't build in order to manufacture the appearance of expertise. He set the phone down. He picked up the coffee. He sat there for a while. It was different this time, and it was the same words being put in the same sequence for the same purpose, to get ahead of the evidence by establishing who the untrustworthy party was before anyone could see what the untrustworthy party had actually done. Halston had built his whole defense around a single load-bearing pillar. Ethan Rourke cannot be trusted. If that pillar held, everything else he'd claimed, the card key, the security breach, the alternative explanation for the credential access, had just enough shadow around it to create reasonable doubt. Ethan knew how to check a load-bearing pillar. He called Caleb. "I've seen it," Caleb said before Ethan could speak. "It's going to get worse before it gets better." "Yes, probably." A pause. "How are you doing?" "I'm fine." "You don't have to say that." Ethan thought about that for a moment. He looked at the kitchen, the two-burner hot plate, the salvaged countertop, the window above the sink that looked out on the back of the storage facility next door. He'd built this space out of what was available, same as everything else, and it worked well enough. It wasn't what he'd imagined his life looking like once, but it worked. "I've been through worse coverage," he said. "The Drexler story ran for 3 months. My name was in it every week." "This is different. You're on the right side of this one." "Being on the right side doesn't mean the coverage reflects that." "No," Caleb said. "It doesn't, but the Federal Review does." A brief silence. "They found something in Vale's external accounts. Adrienne Cho's team. I don't have the details, but Victoria called me 20 minutes ago and said the picture was getting clearer." Ethan set down the coffee cup. "What kind of picture?" "The kind that involves a shell company registered 18 months ago in Delaware with Vale listed as a registered agent, holding a position in a financial instrument that would appreciate significantly in the event of a Whitmore Motors stock collapse." Caleb's voice was dry and precise. Someone who thought they were being very careful left a thread, and the preservation order meant they couldn't pull it before the investigators found the end. Ethan exhaled, slow, the kind of exhale that was less relief than release, the letting go of something you'd been holding tightly without meaning to. Vale's the financial mechanism. Halston's the technical one. That's how it's reading. They needed each other. Halston had the knowledge to build the sabotage. Vale had the legal and financial architecture to monetize the collapse. Neither of them could have done it without the other. He paused. And neither of them could have done it without what happened at Drexler 8 years ago. That was the rehearsal. Ethan, they built the suppression module at Drexler, blamed you for the consequences, and spent 8 years waiting for the right target. Whitmore Motors, autonomous vehicle technology, 8 years of development and 14,000 pre-orders. The prize was worth the wait, from their perspective. Ethan sat very still. Outside, a car passed on the county road. Its headlights swept across the window and moved on. "The Torres credential," he said. "The engineer whose login was used for the midnight access. He's been contacted by the federal investigators. He's cooperating. He had no knowledge of what his credentials were used for." A beat. "He's 26 years old. He'd been at Whitmore for 14 months. He found out last week that his account was used to plan a suppression module that could have killed people." Caleb's voice had something in it that wasn't its usual dry precision. He didn't take it well. Ethan thought about 26. He thought about being 26 and good at something and believing that being good at something was enough protection. "Is he going to be okay?" he asked. "I think so. His union rep is with him. Victoria called him personally." A pause. "She's doing the right things, Ethan. Whatever else is happening with the press coverage, inside that company, she's doing the right things." The formal charges came on a Tuesday, 5 weeks after the board meeting. Victor Halston and Marcus Vale were charged federally with conspiracy to commit wire fraud, intentional introduction of safety hazards into a vehicle system under federal certification review, unauthorized access to protected computer systems, and securities fraud in connection with Vale's financial positioning ahead of the planned company collapse. The charges were accompanied by a 47-page federal indictment that laid out the full architecture of what they'd built over 9 years. Drexler, then the 18-month groundwork at Whitmore, then the 14 weeks of active sabotage. The indictment included a section on Ethan Rourke, not as a defendant, as a named victim of the original Drexler scheme, with a formal finding that the safety documentation failures attributed to him in the original Drexler investigation bore the technical signatures of deliberate external manipulation rather than employee misconduct. He He read that section 4 times. It was 3 paragraphs, 47 pages, and 3 of them were about him. And those 3 paragraphs contained words that no one in any official capacity had ever said about what happened to him before. Words like fabricated attribution and deliberate misdirection of investigative resources. And in the final sentence of the 3rd paragraph, a plain declarative finding. The available evidence does not support the conclusion that Rourke was responsible for the modifications to the Drexler safety certification files. He was sitting in the office behind the garage when he read it, in the chair at the workbench where he'd sat for 6 years doing invoices and parts orders and occasionally falling asleep. The space was small enough that you couldn't really pace in it, which was maybe why he didn't try. He just sat. He thought about calling someone. His mother, Caleb, Victoria. He thought about it, and then he didn't, because what would he say? Here it is. The thing I've been waiting 8 years to exist. 3 paragraphs in a federal document saying what I knew was true and couldn't prove. Thank you for listening. He put the document down on the workbench. Then he picked it up and folded it carefully and put it in the inside pocket of his jacket, next to the notepad that still had the 2 schematics in it. He kept them both there for the rest of the day. He wasn't ready to put either of them somewhere permanent yet. He needed them close, the way you needed close the proof that a thing had actually happened. Marie, Lily found out the way kids found out things when adults were trying to protect them from information, imperfectly, through a combination of overheard conversations and school friends whose parents read the news. She appeared at the garage on a Thursday evening, delivered by Ethan's mother in the usual way, and while his mother went inside to use the bathroom, Lily stood in the bay door with her jacket unzipped and her hands in her pockets and said, "Were you in the news?" Ethan was wiping down a socket set. "A little bit. Tyler Marsh said you got in trouble." "Tyler Marsh is partially wrong." "What's the part he's right about?" Ethan put down the socket set and looked at his daughter. She was 9 and she had her mother's eyes and the specific quality of sustained attention that in adults got called intensity and in children got called difficult. He'd always privately thought it was one of the best things about her. "Some people tried to say I did something wrong," he said, "years ago, before you were born, and then more recently because of the work I was doing here." He paused. "The government looked at everything and said those people were wrong, so I didn't get in trouble. The people who said I did got in trouble." Lily considered this with a focused expression. "Did you know they were saying wrong things about you?" "Yes." "Were you scared?" He thought about the honest answer to that. "When it happened the first time, years ago, yes. I was scared and I didn't handle it very well." He picked up the socket set again, more for something to do with his hands than because it needed more wiping. "This time was different. This time I had evidence." "What's evidence?" "Proof. Things you can show people so they can see for themselves what happened." She nodded slowly. Then, "Is that why you fix cars?" He looked at her. "What do you mean?" "Because in cars you can always find proof of what went wrong." He stood there for a moment. The bay hummed with the sound of the lights. Outside, the county road was quiet. "Yeah," he said. "That's probably part of it." His mother reappeared in the doorway and said dinner wasn't going to make itself, and Lily turned and went inside, and Ethan stood in the bay alone for another minute before he followed. The evening smelled like cold air and oil and something his mother was cooking that involved onions. It smelled like a Thursday, like an ordinary thing. Victoria came to the garage 6 weeks later, not called ahead, not sent an assistant. She just appeared on a Wednesday morning in a car that was not the kind of car that usually parked in the lot at Rourke Auto, and she came in through the bay door while Darius was rewiring a turn signal relay, and Ray was not yet in for the day, and she stood inside the door with her coat on and looked at the space with the particular expression of someone calibrating the distance between what they expected and what they found. Darius looked at her, looked at Ethan, made a quiet tactical decision to become extremely focused on the turn signal relay. "You didn't have to come out here," Ethan said. "I wanted to." She looked around the bay. The lift, the workbench, the tool chest with the stickers Lily had put on the bottom left corner 2 years ago. "How long have you been here?" 6 years? It's smaller than I pictured. Most things are. She looked at him. She had the same quality of controlled stillness she'd had in the lobby the first day, but something in it was different now. Less armor in it, maybe. Or the same armor worn with less effort. The board formalized the Apex 1 launch postponement yesterday, she said. 3 months. We're removing the suppression module from all 4 prototypes, running a complete independent safety audit, and resubmitting the full certification package to the FVSB with a transparency addendum covering everything that was found. She paused. It's going to cost us. The pre-order penalties, the timeline, the press. It's going to be a hard few months. But the vehicle's going to be safe. Yes, the vehicle's going to be safe. She looked at him steadily. The board has also voted to formalize the separation of Victor Halston and Marcus Vale from all company relationships, pending the federal proceeding. Purcell resigned the morning the indictment was filed. He wasn't charged. There wasn't enough to establish that he knew the full scope of what Halston was doing. But he knew something was wrong, and he decided his career interests were better served by keeping quiet about it. She said it without visible anger, more like reading from a ledger. Some people make that choice. Some people do. I'd like to offer you something, she said. Formally, with a contract and a title and a number that I think you'll find fair. She didn't move toward him or reach into a briefcase or produce a document. She just said it plainly, which he appreciated. Director of Vehicle Safety Integrity. You would work independently, or your assessments would not go through engineering or legal. They'd report directly to me and to the board's Safety Oversight Committee. No bureaucratic filter. You find something, it comes straight to the top. She paused. You'd keep this place. The role is consulting-based, flexible schedule. We'd formalize Rourke Auto as an official independent safety partner. Ethan looked at his hands. They were clean right now, which was unusual for 10 in the morning. He'd washed them after the first job of the day, a brake job on a minivan, and hadn't gotten into anything since. He thought about what she was offering. He thought about what it meant to go back. Not to Drexler, not to that world exactly, but to the world adjacent to it, the corporate facilities and the proprietary systems and the politics that lived in buildings like Whitmore Motors. He thought about the 4-floor executive suite and the conference rooms and the particular silence of places where decisions got made, and whether he was the kind of person who could operate in that world without becoming something he didn't want to be again. He thought about the Apex 1 prototypes sitting in that testing bay with their hidden failures, about the 14,000 people who'd pre-ordered a vehicle that was supposed to be the safest thing on the road, about Torres, 26 years old, finding out his credentials had been used to build a bomb inside a machine. The garage stays mine, he said. Full ownership. The partnership is formalized, but the independence is real, not just on paper. Yes. I don't attend board meetings unless there's a specific safety issue that requires board-level discussion. Agreed. And if I find something in your systems that your engineering team doesn't want me to find, I report it to you directly, same day, no delay while anyone figures out the politics. That's the whole point of the role. He nodded slowly. He looked around the bay, at Darius with his relay, at the lift, at the county road visible through the open bay door, at the storage facility across the lot with its corrugated metal wall and its hand-lettered sign. He'd built something out here that worked. It was modest, and it was real, and it was his, and whatever he took on next, that wasn't changing. Okay, he said. Victoria extended her hand. He shook it. Firm, brief, same as the first time. One more thing, she said. My mother would like to have dinner. She wants to thank you properly. I told her it wasn't a big job. She told me to tell you that's not her assessment. He almost smiled. Friday, after 6. Victoria nodded and left the way she'd come, and Darius waited approximately 3 seconds before looking up from the turn signal relay with the expression of someone exercising tremendous restraint. Do not, Ethan said. I'm not saying anything. Good. I'm just noting that the CEO of Whitmore Motors came to our parking lot. The relay. Darius went back to the relay. Machia. The Apex 1 launched on a Thursday in early spring, 3 months behind the original schedule, and with a full-page transparency statement published in 4 national outlets before the first vehicle reached a customer. The statement was written in plain language: no corporate hedging, no passive constructions designed to distribute blame. And it described exactly what had been found in the prototypes, how it had been found, and what had been done to address it. It named the federal investigation. It named the charges against Halston and Vail. It named the safety audit process that had been completed by 3 independent bodies before the first customer received their vehicle. It did not name Ethan Rourke. He'd asked for that specifically. He found out about the launch the way he found out about most things that didn't directly involve a car in front of him. Through his phone, in a brief message from Victoria that said only, "First vehicle delivered. All systems nominal." He read it in the parking lot of the grocery store where he'd stopped on the way home from the shop, with Lily in the passenger seat eating crackers from the bag they'd opened before they paid for them. He typed back, "Good." Lily looked at his phone and then at him with the directness she'd apparently decided to maintain as a permanent feature of her personality. "Is that the car thing?" "The car thing is done." She thought about that. Then she went back to the crackers. Dinner with Margaret Whitmore took place at her home in Grosse Pointe, which was the kind of house that had been built to last a century and was on track to achieve it. Margaret answered the door herself, which Ethan suspected was a choice rather than a necessity, and she wore the same kind of good wool coat she'd had on the highway, except this one was dry, and she was standing in her own doorway rather than in the rain. "You're thinner than I remember," she said. "You saw me for 40 minutes in the dark." "I have a good memory." She stepped back to let him in. "Victoria's already here. She's in the kitchen pretending she knows how to help with dinner, which she doesn't. She never learned." "I heard that," Victoria said from somewhere inside. The house smelled like food and old wood, and the particular warmth of a space that had been lived in by the same family for a long time. They ate at a table that seated 12 and used 4 chairs, which left a large amount of formal mahogany unoccupied in a way that felt deliberately uncommentable. Margaret had made pot roast. She'd made it herself. When Ethan mentioned this, she said she'd made pot roast every winter for 53 years and saw no reason to stop because her daughter ran a company. "Victoria tells me you turned down a large salary," Margaret said. She said it conversationally, the way you mention weather. "I asked for independence instead. That's usually the smarter trade." She passed him the bread without asking if he wanted it. "What will you do with it?" "The same thing I've been doing. Look at machines. Find what's wrong with them." "And your garage?" "That stays." Margaret looked at him for a moment with the assessment look he'd first seen on the highway. He'd gotten used to it. He understood now that it was less judgment than genuine curiosity. The look of someone who found people interesting in the way other people found puzzles interesting and had never bothered to pretend otherwise. "The night I was stranded," she said, "I'd been having a bad few months. I don't mean the car, I mean generally. My husband passed 3 years ago, and there are still days that feel—" She stopped, not because she was emotional, but because she was choosing the accurate word. "Unorganized. Nights when I'm driving home from somewhere and the house seems farther away than it used to." She looked at her plate. "I was thinking about that when you pulled over, about how far away things can feel." Ethan didn't say anything. He waited. "You fixed my car and refused money and told me exactly what to do to protect myself, and then you walked back to your truck." She looked up. "You didn't make a production of it. You didn't ask for anything. You just did the thing that needed doing and left." She picked up her fork. "I've been in rooms with very important people my whole life, Mr. Rourke. That kind of thing is rarer than it should be." Ethan looked at the bread on his plate. "My truck broke down in a storm once. I was 22. A man stopped and spent an hour in the rain getting it running. He wouldn't take anything either. I asked him why, and he said someone did it for him once, and he figured it kept going that way." Margaret considered that. "Did you believe him?" "Not at the time. I was 22. He paused. "I believe it now." Victoria was looking at him across the table with the expression she'd had in the testing bay when she'd said, "I believe you about Drexler." The practical expression, not warm exactly, but real. He'd come to understand that real was what she had instead of warm, and that it was worth considerably more. They ate for a while without talking, and it was the comfortable kind of silence, the kind that didn't need to be filled. He drove home at 9:30, back down the county road, past the shuttered diner and the storage facility, and into the lot at Rourke Auto. He parked and sat in the truck for a moment, same as he always did. The sky had cleared during dinner and there were stars visible, which didn't happen often this close to the city's edge. He took the notepad out of his jacket pocket. The folded federal document was in there too, and he took that out as well. He held them both, the notepad with the 2 schematics in it, 8 years of a mystery reduced to 2 pencil drawings that turned out to be the same drawing, and the 3 paragraphs that said in federal language what he'd known was true and never been able to prove. He thought about what to do with them, about whether to keep them or let them go. Some people kept things like that as reminders. Some people kept them as wounds. He'd met both kinds, and he knew the difference wasn't in the thing itself, but in what you did with the weight of it. He put the notepad in the glove compartment. He kept the federal document in his jacket pocket, not as a wound, just as something that had happened, that was real, that deserved to exist somewhere other than in his memory. He got out of the truck. Inside the garage, the lift sat at rest, and the workbench was clean from the end of the day. And the tool chest with Lily's stickers on the bottom corner caught the light from the window the way it always did. The space was exactly what it had been 6 years ago when he'd signed the lease on a county road in Michigan with nothing much to recommend it, except that the rent was manageable and it had the right bones. He didn't turn the shop lights on. He stood in the doorway for a moment, letting his eyes adjust, looking at the shape of the place he'd built. The phone in his pocket buzzed once. A message from Darius. Torres called the shop. He wants to know if we're hiring. Ethan read it twice. Then he typed back. Tell him to come in Thursday. We'll talk. He put the phone away and stood in the quiet of the garage with the cold air coming in through the open bay door and the stars doing their thing above the county road. Somewhere down the road, a truck passed. A big one, by the sound of it, moving fast on the straightaway, headlights briefly touching the asphalt and then gone. The sound faded west and the night went quiet again. He thought about Caleb Morgan, who had driven a cracked dashboard Subaru out here and eaten gas station sandwiches at midnight, and checked his logic like a man who understood that truth without structure was just opinion. He thought about Ingram, precise and efficient and willing to put her name on findings that put her in a difficult position with people above her. He thought about Victoria, standing in a boardroom she was supposed to be removed from, presenting evidence she'd been told would be challenged, saying, I should have done it sooner, about a federal contact she'd only brought in because a mechanic on a county road had told her to move carefully. He thought about Lily at the dinner table asking why he fixed things, and the answer he'd given her, and whether it was actually true or just true enough. He decided it was true enough. Most honest things were. The Apex One was on the road. Somewhere out there on the interstates and the county roads and the parking lots and the overpasses of a country full of people going from one place to another, a vehicle that had been designed to be safe and then almost made dangerous and then made safe again, was doing what it was built to do. The people inside it didn't know any of this. They knew they'd bought a car. They knew it started and steered and stopped. They didn't know about the suppression module or the midnight credential session or the 2 schematics on a notepad in a glove compartment. They didn't need to. That was the point. The point was that the thing worked the way it was supposed to work, and the people who'd built it to fail had been stopped, and the work was done. Ethan turned and went inside. He filled the kettle on the 2-burner and set it to heat and sat at the workbench in the office space behind the partition, the same workbench where he'd drawn the schematics at 2 a.m. 3 months ago, when all of this was just a relay disconnect and a question he couldn't stop asking. The coffee he made was too strong, same as always. He drank it at the workbench with the lamp on and the rest of the garage dark, and it was quiet out on the county road, and the storage facility next door had its security light on, throwing a rectangle of yellow across the asphalt outside the bay door. He had a Chevy Silverado coming in at 8 tomorrow morning. Bad wheel bearing on the rear axle. Customer had described the noise as a low grinding that got worse at highway speeds, which was exactly what a failing wheel bearing sounded like. Straightforward job. 2, maybe 3 hours including the press work. He'd have it done by noon. He finished the coffee. He washed the cup and set it to dry on the small rack beside the 2-burner And he turned off the lamp, and in the dark of the garage on the county road, he stood still for one more moment. Not because he was thinking about anything particular, but because the stillness was his, and the space was his, and the day was over, and it had ended the way days were supposed to end, with the next one already waiting. He went to bed. Outside, the stars kept their old positions, and the county road ran straight toward the city and the highway and all the distances beyond that. And somewhere out on those roads, the machines were moving, and they were safe, and the night was cold and clear and did not ask anything of anyone. It was enough.